For 10 straight years, my father stood up at every single family reunion and introduced me the same way. This is my daughter, Vanessa. She had every opportunity and chose to waste it on spreadsheets in the city. Every year, the same laugh from the same relatives. What none of them knew, standing in that backyard with their paper plates and their pity, was that I spent my days restructuring companies that were exactly one bad quarter away from collapse. And 3 weeks ago, a file landed on my desk with our family's name on it. My father's company was drowning, and the only signature standing between saving it and losing everything was mine. If you've ever been the family failure who turned out to be the only one paying attention, stay with me because this story ends somewhere none of them saw coming. And if you like these stories, go ahead and subscribe now. My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 34 and I work as a restructuring advisor at Ashcroft Capital, the kind of firm companies call when the bank has already stopped returning their calls. I evaluate failing businesses for a living. I just never expected one of them to be my own family's. I grew up in Millbrook, a town built almost entirely around one thing. Cole Auto Group 4 dealerships my grandfather started in the 60s, and my father, Walt, expanded into the biggest employer in the county. My older brother, Derek, was groomed for it from the time he could walk summers on the lot, washing cars, then finance meetings by 16, then an actual office by 22. I was groomed for something else entirely, though nobody ever said what. Just not that. I remember being maybe 14, standing in the showroom after school doing homework at a desk nobody used, and hearing my father tell a customer with real pride in his voice that his son would be running this place someday. I remember doing the math even then quietly, the way I'd later do it professionally, noticing that nobody had ever said anything like that about me. Not because I hadn't tried, but because the story of the family business had been written before I was old enough to audition for a part in it. I left for college and studied finance, which my father treated less like an achievement and more like a small betrayal, a girl choosing numbers on paper over the family's actual tangible business. When I took a job in the city after graduation in distressed asset advisory, he asked me once, genuinely puzzled, what exactly I did all day. I told him I helped struggling companies figure out whether they could be saved or whether it was kinder to let them go. He laughed, not unkindly exactly, and said that sounded like a very complicated way to avoid getting your hands dirty. That was the last time he asked. The reunions started their particular rhythm somewhere around my mid-20s. Cole family reunions happened every August, the whole extended clan at my parents' property outside Millbrook, folding tables under the oak trees, my aunt's potato salad, the same photos taken in the same spots every year, the same volleyball net sagging in the same corner of the yard. My cousins would arrive with their own kids by then, and every year the crowd got a little larger, a little louder. And every year my father found the same small window in the afternoon to make sure everyone understood exactly how the two of us compared. And every year at some point during the afternoon, my father would gather people's attention and introduce whoever needed introducing to whichever cousin's new spouse had shown up that summer. This is Derek, he'd say, runs the whole western region for the dealerships, now doing incredible work. Then turning slightly, almost as an afterthought, and this is Vanessa. She had every opportunity and chose to waste it on spreadsheets in the city. The laugh that followed was small and practiced the kind of laugh a family develops around a joke they've told so many times nobody remembers whether it was ever funny. I want to be honest about something. For the first few years, it actually hurt in a simple, uncomplicated way. I was good at my job. I was by any reasonable measure doing well. But somewhere around year 4 or 5, the hurt curdled into something more useful. A very precise, very quiet attention to exactly how the family talked about money, about the business, about Derek's supposed successes. I stopped explaining my job to people who'd already decided it didn't count. I just started listening more carefully to everything else. ACET 2 escalation, 6:14 no. By year 7, the tone at the reunions had shifted slightly, though I doubt anyone else noticed. Derek's stories about incredible growth started sounding thinner, more rehearsed, heavier on adjectives, and lighter on actual numbers. My father's toasts got a little too enthusiastic about weathering the storm in the broader auto retail market, a phrase that told me professionally exactly what it usually tells me. Someone was preparing an excuse in advance. At year 8's reunion, my Aunt Carol 3 glasses of wine and cornered me by the dessert table and said not unkindly, "You know your father worries about you, Vanessa. All that money and no husband, no house, nothing to show for it." I asked her what exactly Derek had to show for his region that year. She blinked clearly, not expecting the question, and said something vague about a lot of moving pieces right now. I filed that away the way I file every vague non-answer professionally, as information. That same afternoon, I overheard my father on the phone near the garage. His voice pitched low the way people pitch their voices when they don't want a conversation carrying across a backyard full of relatives. I caught only fragments, something about the covenant deadline, something about buying a little more time before he noticed me nearby, and ended the call abruptly, too casually, the way you hang up when you want someone to believe nothing important just happened. I didn't ask him about it. I'd learned by then that direct questions just produced more vague, honey-toned non-answers, and vague non-answers were professionally worth more to me than a rehearsed explanation would have been. The actual crack came the following spring, 18 months before the file landed on my desk. My mother called something she rarely did outside of holidays, and mentioned almost in passing that Derek had been handling some challenges with the Western dealerships that Walt had taken out a bit of financing to cover a rough stretch. I asked what kind of financing. She said she didn't really understand all that Walt handled it. I asked how large the rough stretch actually was. She laughed the same laugh from the reunions and said, "Oh, Vanessa, you and your numbers. It's under control." It was not, as it turned out, under control. 9 months before the file landed on my desk at the 9th reunion in this particular streak, my father delivered the line one more time, wasted on spreadsheets in the city, and this time I noticed something new in his voice underneath the practiced laugh. A thinness and edge of genuine strain he probably didn't even realize was audible. Derek's toast that year ran long and defensive, heavy on words like repositioning and strategic pivot, words I recognized from 100 client meetings as the specific vocabulary people reach for right before things get very bad very quickly. I didn't say anything that day either. I drove back to the city that night, turning the numbers over in my head, the ones I could infer from what I'd heard, and I didn't like the shape they made. 3 weeks before the file landed on my desk, Derek called me directly for the first time in over a year, his voice warm in a way it hadn't been since we were kids. "Hey, Nessa, been thinking about you," he said, and asked how the city was treating me, whether I liked my job, whether I ever worked with, actual companies, real ones, not just paper. I recognized the shape of the conversation almost immediately, the warmth arriving exactly when it was needed, rather than whenever it might have been sincere. I answered vaguely the way I answer vague questions professionally, giving him nothing to work with, and he hung up sounding faintly disappointed, like he'd been fishing and come up empty. 2 days later, my mother texted out of nowhere, asking if I might have any contacts in finance who could help a family friend's struggling business described in language, just specific enough that I recognized every detail as belonging to Cole Auto Group. I didn't respond right away. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time, doing the math I'd been quietly building toward for 3 years without ever admitting it to myself. I called her back that evening mostly to see how far she'd go without actually naming the company. She talked in careful circles for almost 10 minutes, mentioning a business Walt's been advising, asking pointed questions about whether Ashcroft handled situations like this, whether I personally reviewed files, or just did the technical side. I recognized the shape of it immediately, the same reconnaissance instinct I'd cataloged professionally in a hostile acquisition, someone testing the edges of what I already knew, without risking the vulnerability of actually asking directly. I gave her nothing specific the way I'd give a stranger nothing specific, and she got off the phone sounding disappointed in a way she probably didn't fully understand herself. Before I tell you what was actually in that file, I want to know if your family spent 10 years calling you the failure, while their own success was quietly falling apart, would you have said something the moment you suspected it, or waited the way I did? Tell me in the comments. The file landed on my desk on a Tuesday. Ashcroft Capital had recently acquired a distressed credit position from a regional bank, a package of loans made to mid-sized retail and auto operations across 3 states, all of them showing serious signs of default risk. My job was to evaluate each one and recommend whether Ashcroft should work with the borrower on a restructuring plan or move toward liquidation. The 7th file in the stack was labeled Cole Auto Group LLC. I sat with my hand flat on my desk for a full minute before I opened it. The office around me kept moving the way offices do, someone's phone ringing 2 desks over the low hum of the printer down the hall, none of it registering while I stared at a manila tab with my own last name printed on it in 12-point font as ordinary and administrative as every other file in the stack except that it wasn't. The numbers were worse than anything I'd inferred from 18 months of vague family phone calls. Cole Auto Group owed $41 million against a loan originally issued for $22, the difference explained by 2 years of missed covenant terms, penalty interest, and a series of short-term bridge loans Derek had apparently taken out, without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. Buried 3 pages into the loan history was something that made my stomach drop, in a way the debt numbers alone hadn't. A pattern of distributions to Walt Cole personally structured as management fees, totaling just under $2 million over 3 years, pulled out of the company at exactly the moments cash flow was tightest. My father hadn't just mismanaged the business. He'd been quietly draining it while telling everyone, including his own son, that the company was simply weathering a difficult market. I called my supervisor, a careful, exacting man named Ari Feldman, and told him I had a conflict of interest. The borrower was my family. Ari didn't hesitate. "Then you're the best person on this file," he said, "because you'll actually look at it properly instead of taking their explanations at face value. Just disclose it formally and let compliance sign off. You don't recuse yourself from doing your job well because it's uncomfortable." I filed the disclosure that afternoon. Compliance cleared me within 2 days with one condition. Any final terms had to be reviewed by a second senior advisor before signing standard procedure. Nothing unusual, though I noticed my hands were not entirely steady typing the acknowledgement. Over the following 2 weeks, I did what I do for every distressed file, except this time every number had a face attached to it. I traced every distribution, every missed payment, every renegotiated term. I built the restructuring options the way I'd build them for any client. A full liquidation scenario, which would close all 4 dealerships and lay off roughly 210 employees, many of whom I'd known my whole childhood, and a workout scenario, which would keep the business running under significantly tighter oversight, reduced ownership stake for Walt mandatory third-party financial controls, and full repayment restructured over 8 years. The workout scenario was viable. The numbers actually worked if, and this was the condition I built in deliberately, ownership accepted external financial oversight strong enough to prevent exactly the kind of quiet personal draw that had gotten them here in the first place. I spent one entire evening just sitting with the 210 employee names in the impact spreadsheet, recognizing at least a dozen of them. Mr. Halloran, who'd sold my parents their first minivan, a woman named Denise, who'd worked the parts counter since before I was born. The liquidation scenario wasn't an abstraction to me the way most files were. I understood in a way I rarely let myself feel professionally exactly what was actually writing on which column I recommended. I called Ari again that week, not about the conflict this time, but about the human weight of it, something I don't usually admit to a supervisor. "I keep thinking about the parts counter lady," I told him. "She's worked there since before I was born." Ari was quiet for a moment, then said something that stayed with me. "That's exactly why this needs to be you, and not someone who's never set foot in that building. You'll fight harder for the workout option than anyone who sees it as just a file number." He was right, though it took the whole restructuring process for me to understand how right. Derek called again the week before the scheduled restructuring meeting. This time not warm, just frightened the fishing entirely abandoned. Ashcroft's sending someone Thursday to go over our options, he said. Dad's a wreck, Nessa. I don't even know if we lose the dealerships. I told him I was sorry to hear that. I did not tell him who was coming Thursday. Some things I'd decided needed to be said in the room, not over the phone, where a decade of practiced laughter couldn't soften what was actually true. The meeting was held in the Cole Auto Group's own conference room, the one with the framed photo of my grandfather cutting the ribbon on the first dealership in 1968. Walt sat at the head of the table, Derek beside him, a lawyer I didn't recognize on their other side. I walked in with Ari and our compliance counsel exactly on time, and I watched my father's face move through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked almost like fear in that order in about 4 seconds. Vanessa, he said, what are you doing here? I work for Ashcroft Capital, I said. I've been assigned to your file for the past 3 weeks. Derek's expression cracked first. You've known this whole time? You let me call you and beg for contacts while you were all ready. I disclosed the conflict the day the file landed on my desk, I said. Compliance cleared me. I've spent 3 weeks building the only viable path that doesn't end with 210 people losing their jobs in a town that doesn't have much else. Derek sat back in his chair, jaw tight, and for a moment I watched him deciding whether to be angry at me or at the situation itself, the two feelings clearly tangled together in a way he hadn't sorted out yet. Walt's lawyer opened a folder, started to say something about reviewing terms with the appropriate Ashcroft representative, and Ari said simply, "She is the appropriate representative. These are her terms." My father looked at me the way you look at a door you didn't know was there. I laid the two scenarios on the table side by side, the way I always do for a client liquidation on the left, full closure timeline, employee impact numbers, asset sale projections, the workout plan on the right repayment schedule, oversight structure, the reduced ownership terms. This is what happens if Ashcroft moves to liquidate, I said, tapping the left page. This is the only alternative anyone has offered that keeps the dealerships open. I tapped the right page. The difference between them is whether you're willing to accept oversight strong enough to make sure the $2 million in personal distributions that helped create this shortfall never happens again. My father's face went pale in a way I hadn't expected hearing the number said out loud in front of Derek and his own lawyer. That was compensation for it was structured as management fees pulled during your 3 worst cash flow quarters, I said. I've read every page. I'm not asking you to explain it to me. I'm telling you what the oversight terms require going forward. Derek turned to his father slowly, and I watched a version of the math I'd already done 3 weeks earlier land on him in real time. You told me the shortfall was market conditions, he said, quiet, more wounded than angry. You let me tell the bank that. You let me tell everyone that. Walt didn't answer him. For a moment, something genuine crossed my father's face. Not performance. Something closer to a man realizing all at once how thoroughly he'd been the architect of his own family's precarious 10 years. The reunions, the strain in his own toasts, the waste it on spreadsheets line he'd delivered so many times it had become reflexive. I didn't think it would come to this, he said quietly, and for a second I almost felt something soften in my chest. Then he straightened and something more familiar returned to his voice. I built this company from nothing before you were even born, Vanessa. I don't need my own daughter lecturing me about oversight in my own conference room. You built it? I said. I'm the reason there's still a company left to argue about owning. He tried once more, quieter this time, almost cornered. You had every opportunity and chose to waste it on. You've said that exact sentence at every reunion for 10 years, I said, and I let the silence after it sit for a moment before continuing. It worked the first few times. It doesn't work anymore, Dad. Not in this room with these numbers in front of you. Derek, to his credit, was the one who spoke next quietly to his father, rather than to me. Dad. Just sign it. Walt looked at his son for a long moment, then at the folder, then finally at me. He picked up the pen. This is a very complicated way to save your own family, he said. Not quite an apology, but close enough that I let it stand. It's actually a fairly simple restructuring, I said. You just spent 10 years assuming complicated meant worthless. He signed. Derek signed beside him. The lawyer initialed the oversight terms without further comment. I gathered my copies, shook hands with everyone at the table except my father, who didn't offer his, and walked out to my car in the same gravel lot I'd learned to drive in 20 years earlier. I used to think being underestimated meant I had something to prove. What that conference room taught me is that the people most certain you've wasted your life are often the ones who never once asked what you actually built while they weren't watching. Cole Auto Group is still open, all 4 locations, all 210 jobs intact under oversight terms my firm reviews quarterly. My father hasn't called since the signing. Derek has twice, mostly to ask logistics questions. Neither of us frame as personal, careful conversations that stay on the surface of things because neither of us has figured out yet what a deeper one would even sound like. There was a 10th reunion this past August, the first one since the signing. I didn't go. My mother called to ask why, her voice doing the same careful, practiced warmth it always does, and I told her honestly that I wasn't ready to find out whether the joke about spreadsheets had actually retired or just gone quiet for a season. She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think anyone in that family has fully worked out yet what to say about me now that the old story doesn't hold together the way it used to. I don't know if there's a version of my family where the reunions stop needing a punchline entirely, where Derek and I talk about something other than logistics, where my father says the thing he almost said in that conference room, instead of retreating back into pride the moment it got uncomfortable. I've stopped waiting to find out. Some repairs happen slowly in small increments over years nobody announces. Others just don't happen, and you learn to build a full life anyway, the way I already had been for the 10 years nobody at those reunions bothered to ask about. If your family ever underestimated exactly what you were building while they weren't looking, I want to hear about it. Tell me what happened in the comments below. If this story hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear that being the quiet one in the room doesn't mean being the smallest one in it. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because next week's story might be the one that feels like it was written about your own family.